Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to today's Lunch and Learn. I have a few things for everyone before we get started. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Izzy. I'm an intern here at Trees Atlanta. Second of all, I would like to share with you our mission at Trees Atlanta. Let's see if I can get my slides to work here. Let's see. There we go. All righty. Trees Atlanta's mission is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forests by planting, conserving, and educating. Again, welcome everybody for a positive and efficient interactive virtual learning event with Trees Atlanta. We are going to have time for questions at the end of the event. You can use the Q&A button or the chat feature, and we'll go through questions at the end and then maybe even throughout the event if we have time. So feel free to leave your questions or comments in the chat or the Q&A. We also would love your feedback for today's event. You're going to receive an email after the event that has a survey that we would love for you to take just so we can improve your experience as best we can. And then you can also sign up for our newsletter to keep up with us for any upcoming events. If you're interested, these are all of our social media handles as well. It's Trees Atlanta on every platform. And then finally, I would like to introduce our speaker. Her name is Melanie Furr. She's from Georgia Audubon, and she is the Director of Education there. Melanie, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking time to join me today to learn about hummingbirds. You might have heard we're going to have a special guest joining us in just a little while. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. This will be an informal talk taking you through a year in the life of a hummingbird and also talking about their importance in the environment and the threats that they face and ways we can help. If you have questions, as Izzy mentioned, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm happy to try to answer them as we go along, and we'll also have time for questions at the end. Can everyone see my screen? Hopefully. I'll proceed and let us know if there are any problems. So today we're going to learn about a magical little bird, a bird that sort of mystifies and captivates all of us, the ruby-throated hummingbird. But for those of you that have not joined our flock, I'd like to share a little bit about Georgia Audubon. Our mission is to build places where birds and people thrive, and we do that in a number of ways. We've got a lot of on-the-ground habitat work, restoration, our wildlife sanctuary certification program. We offer free field trips around the metro area, kind of spread out north, south, east, and west. And we invite you to join us for those. You just have to register online, but they're open to anybody. We've got a lot of great bird and nature workshops. We visit schools. We've got a lot of opportunities for volunteers. So I invite you to check out our website, georgiaaudubon.org, and learn a little bit more about us and join our flock. I also like to have everyone consider when I do my talks for a minute about why do birds matter? Why should we take the time to conserve them, protect them, appreciate them? They do a lot of different things in the environment that provide benefits to people. So I'd invite folks, maybe if you would, to type a few answers in the chat. What are some ways that birds are helping us in the environment or in other ways. Well, since our program today is talking about pollinators, we'll start with that. What hummingbirds do? They provide pollination services. There are lots of services that birds provide in the environment.
Melanie, I've got a few answers coming in. I've got a few talking about pest control. They eat insects, and then also they spread seeds around the environment.
Great answers. Yes, so tons of pest control. Insects, primarily. 99% of our terrestrial birds are eating and feeding their young insects in the spring. So that's a huge pest control service that they're providing. But our birds of prey and birds like crows and other corvids are, taking care of rodents, other small mammals, and other animals, cleaning up carrion. So we've got the vultures that are cleaning up carrion. Seed dispersal was another thing that someone mentioned. So birds do that in a number of ways. They either eat a fruit and they can't digest the seed. They fly off, they deposit it out the other end, already fertilized. Lots of birds hide and cache seeds. Jays and crows in particular will cache hundreds of acorns, up to even 1,000 acorns in the winter. Many of them they might retrieve for a later snack, but a lot of them are already in the ground germinating. So forest regeneration is another big service that birds provide. Anything else, Izzy, that people noted before I share my list?
There's another one that says they make us much more cheerful people. They make us notice things in nature we would not notice without them, making us more aware and more protective in the process. And then the last one says, and honestly, can you imagine a life without them? The joyless silence.
I love those answers. And yes, they do bring us joy. They're one of the easiest ways that we can just step outside no matter where we are and connect with wildlife. I kind of think of them as a gateway drug into nature, because once you start noticing birds, you start thinking, well, what tree is that bird on? What insect is that bird eating? What, all sorts of behaviors and, fascinating things to notice when you start paying attention to birds. And yeah, the silence that we would have, Silent Spring, right? Sort of launched the environmental movement, talking about the loss of birds and how much we would lose if we lost our bird song. So here's my list. They add to biodiversity. They're an important part of the food chain as both predators and prey. They're important ecosystem engineers. So those are animals that actually create habitat for other animals. Can you think of a family of birds that creates homes for other animals? I'll give a hint. Woodpeckers excavate cavities to raise their young, but they don't live in those nests year round. And when they leave them, they become nesting sites for smaller birds, owls, chickadees, flying squirrels, gray squirrels. So all sorts of other animals can take advantage of those cavities. They're on all 7 continents, and I would add all 7 seas. So again, no matter where you go in the world, birds are there providing these services and there to delight us. They disperse seeds and pollinate flowers. They're part of the cleanup crew, those vultures and crows and jays, as I mentioned. They control pests of all sorts. They're biological indicators, the canaries in the coal mine, if you will. They're very sensitive to environmental change. So the fact that their numbers are declining at a very alarming rate should be a wake-up call for us as well. They're a source of beauty and inspiration. They're a great platform for teaching, and they add economic value. All that pest control, seed dispersal, pollination, it's literally billions of dollars worth of environmental services each year. But today we're going to focus on one bird. And in Georgia, we have only one species of breeding hummingbird, and that is the ruby-throated hummingbird. You might see some birds that look a little different at your feeders. So here on this top photo, we've got the male, who, the species is named for that vibrant ruby throat on the male. Females do not have a bright throat. And then here down on the bottom left, we've got a juvenile male, just a little ruby speckle starting to come in, but they don't have the ruby throat when they're born, the males. They will molt into that plumage. So we're going to go through a year in the life, as I mentioned, and then when we wrap up, I'll introduce you to Georgia Audubon's ambassador hummingbird, Sibley, who's waiting on camera, waiting for his debut on camera with you, and we'll answer questions. So I start to get a lot of questions this time of year about why people aren't seeing any hummingbirds. So now we're in sort of the middle, getting towards summer. I was about to say middle of summer. Summer really just started, but for a busy hummingbird, summer is already half over. They typically arrive in early spring. So in the Atlanta area, it's late March. I think I had my first one on March 25th this year. Generally, it's the males that arrive first. They're eager to get to the best breeding territories, stake that, claim for themselves, and await the arrival of the females. So the females arrive, a couple, 2-3 weeks later. So, mid-April, but by mid to late April, those birds are really trying to settle down on their breeding grounds in Georgia. Many of them keep going all the way up to Canada. But by late April, they're ready to start breeding here in Georgia. There's a picture of their range map. So this peachy pink area is their breeding range. You can see, as I mentioned, it goes all the way up into Canada and a little west of the Mississippi corridor. The yellow is their migration route for some of the birds. We'll talk more about their migration a little later on. And the blue is their wintering range. So as you can see, there's a little spot of blue there in South Florida, but for the most part, they leave North America in the winter. They can't meet their needs here in wintertime. But when they arrive in spring, they've got one thing on their minds, and that is to reproduce, to pass on their genes to the next generation. And here is a video shot of a male ruby throat displaying in front of a female who's hard to see, but she's perched there on the feeder, kind of assessing whether or not she's interested in him. So he's trying to show her his bright ruby colors, showing her how acrobatic he is, that he can hover from side to side. If you're lucky enough to witness this in your own yard, it can be much more dramatic. The males will actually make these wide sweeping arcs back and forth. They're chittering and chirping. They can't sing, but they do make noise. They chirp and twitter. So he'll make these wide arcs in front of her and try to turn his ruby throat into the light to impress her. Got another video here. This is not a ruby throat. This is a Costas hummingbird, which is a Western species. But it'll give you an idea of how dramatic these displays can be.
Both birds are looking for a partner, but the choice of mate will be hers. It's up to him to impress her. He moves in close, hovering directly in front of her, rocking his entire body back and forth in a display of flying prowess. Though his back shimmers with green, it's not until we get her point of view that we see his true splendor. He flexes the iridescent feathers of his mantle, a until they become a glowing mask of violet. Facing into the blazing sun, he swoops back and forth, his face a fiery flower before her. How can she possibly resist him? And yet she does, leaving him to return to his perch. Perfecting his performance is going to take some practice.
PBS Nature documentary on hummingbirds. So again, the males are going to try to flash those ruby colors and perform their acrobatic flight displays. They are the only birds that can truly hover. There are other species, families of birds that can manage a few seconds of hovering flight or position themselves in the wind so that they can hover for a period of time. But hummingbirds are the only birds that can truly hover. They accomplish it by flapping their wings in a figure-8 pattern. So the male, as I said, is going to perform that acrobatic hovering flight and show those ruby colors. But those colors are actually all a trick of the light. There is actually no red ruby pigment in the feather at all. So the top photo here shows the actual color of the feather, absence of light. It's just sort of a dark slatey gray, almost black. But when it's, the light hits it in the right way, it reflects color, primarily red ruby colors. But if you look at pictures of Sibley and see him in his videos, sometimes his throat can look green or gold or orange, depending on the light. So here we have Sibley, who you'll be meeting momentarily. But you'll notice as he turns into the light, he's got that full, fiery ruby throat with that shiny iridescence. Little wing flutter there. But as he turns out of the light, you can see the actual color of the feather. As I said, almost black. No color there at all. So if the male is successful in attracting the female with his colors and his flight, she takes over. Essentially done. He does nothing to help raise his offspring. She will build the nest by herself. Takes her a week to 10 days. She'll gather soft plant fibers. She'll weave them together with spider webs. Great reason to leave those cobwebs in the corner of your porch. And then she'll decorate the outside with lichen to camouflage it. These nests can be, anywhere from 10 or 12 feet all the way up to 30 feet. They usually are on a horizontal branch, and they'll often just look like a little knob on the branch. So they can be very hard to find. I've only found, I think, 2 in all my years of birding. And I do a little quiet dance. I'm always giddy when I find one. If you look on the bottom of my screen, the male, females always lay 2 eggs, about the size of a jelly bean. So their nests are very tiny. They will sit on those eggs for about 3 weeks, only leaving to, stretch their wings and get something to eat and drink. The male, as I mentioned, is absent during all of this. He's a deadbeat dad. When the babies hatch at about 3 weeks, naked and blind and totally helpless and dependent on their mother. So she is really busy at that point. She will fly around feeding, eating insects, drinking nectar. She will fly back to feed them every 10 or 15 minutes all day long for, as long as there is light in the sky. As you can see, she will insert her bill all the way down through their throat and into a pouch called their crop, which precedes their stomach. I'll show you a photo in a minute. And here we've got a couple of hatchlings. So as you can see, just naked and blind, tiny little beaks. You'll notice that their beaks are bright yellow. That's sort of a evolutionary trick to sort of flag the mom, feed me, feed me. They will, as they grow, you can see here starting to get a little bit of the black keratin on the outside of their beaks as their beaks harden and form. Here's a video of mom flying in to feed her babies. So they're sleeping, but as she lands on the nest, they sort of feel that vibration, hear her maybe making little noises, and they wake up and open those yellow gapes, as I mentioned. She's gonna put her bill all the way down to the bottom of their throat and regurgitate a slurry mixture of sugar and protein for them. And you'll notice after she flies off that the birds are, the chicks are pre-programmed for pretty neat behavior. A lot of baby birds are programmed to do this. But you'll notice there they stick their little, that one sticking his little backside over the edge of the nest to eject his waste so that they don't soil the nest and get dirty or attract predators. So they keep their nest very clean. He's stretching his wings, getting his business done outside the nest. So the babies will fledge at about 3 weeks. So they incubated for about 3 weeks. They spend about 3 weeks.
Oh no, it looks like we lost Melanie. Let's give her 1 second to see if she can rejoin. In the meantime, you guys are asking some great questions. I see them in the chat. Oh, I see that there have been some Zoom issues with other people today. I wonder if that has anything to do with it. We'll give her some time to reconnect here. I'll get in contact with her. Melanie, we've got you back. All righty. Oh, it looks like you're still muted.
Okay, I'm not sure when I lost you.
Let's see.
We were talking about hummingbird metabolism.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And how they burn a tremendous amount of sugar. They need to eat every 10 or 15 minutes all day long. Is this the last slide that you saw that I had up?
I believe so.
Great.
Oh, I got in the chat that we were on the summer slide still. Let's see here.
Okay.
Yep.
So I'm not sure when I cut off. I'm sorry about that.
It is okay.
Don't know if you heard me say that here's a little bird that I had in rehab, just showing off his very wide gape. They will fly around and catch insects in mid-flight, opening their bills wide like that. Mom's going to provide care for another 2 or 3 weeks once they're out of the nest. So during the summer months, it's really about, eating. Hummingbirds have a tremendously fast and efficient metabolism. So they have a lot of sugar in their diet. It's not exclusively sugar. They do catch a lot of insects, but they can burn a tremendous amount of calories and sugar. And if humans could keep up with their metabolism and efficiency for metabolizing sugars, we could drink a Coke every minute of the day for 12 hours. So hummingbirds have a really high paced and high energy demand diet and lifestyle. So planting those nectar rich flowers, especially the native ones that will also support the insect life, is a great way to help your hummingbirds. And we'll talk more about that. So they do love nectar, and they get in those long tubular flowers with a very long tongue. It's twice as long as their bill. When it's retracted in their mouth, it actually wraps around the back of their skull. So they can get in those really deep flowers that they love, that have the richest nectar reservoirs. I mentioned that hummingbirds have an extra sac before their stomach for storing food. So because they are moving so fast, their energy demands are so high. If they find a good flower patch, they're going to want to fill up as full as they can. And they have an extra little sac for doing that called a crop. There are a lot of bird families that have a crop. Hawks also have it. So if they find a big rabbit and it's really more than they can digest, they can sort of fill that crop and digest slowly. But here you see Sibley when he was a young bird. He hadn't quite grown his ruby throat yet. He was molting. The only reason we can see this protruding sac there, he is just filled up on nectar right there. So I mentioned molting. Hummingbirds have over 900 feathers on their tiny little bodies. They only weigh about as much as a penny, so they're really small, smaller than you think when you get up close to them. And they replace all those feathers once a year, not all at once, obviously, but a little at a time. Here you can see some of these little white spiky feathers. Those are called pin feathers. Those are feathers that are being replaced. You can see that Sibley had lost one of his throat feathers here on the towel. Only the tips of those throat feathers actually show the ruby. You can see that in this feather too, but the way they overlap gives us that sort of full scarf of ruby. Here's Sibley catching a spider. So he cannot fly. He was injured in a window collision. You'll be meeting him shortly. But he does love to catch insects. So for enrichment for him, I will catch some spiders from my porch. He knows when a twig is coming his way with something dangling that he's got a little tasty treat. So he's eyeing it. He sees it. There's that little tiny spider, but he just snatches it right up. So hummingbirds really don't pick up insects. They can pick things up, but they don't then have the mechanism to get it to the back of their throat to swallow. So they will catch their insect prey in flight. So aside from eating, self-care is obviously important to a bird, and hummingbirds accomplish their bathing by sort of shimmying on wet leaves. Again, there's Sibley. He can't fly, but he still likes to shimmy on misted leaves and have his bath. If you pay a lot of attention to birds outside, you'll see wild hummingbirds doing this, usually first thing in the morning when the leaves are wet with dew, and they'll fly from one leaf to another and just sort of wiggle. You might sometimes also catch them flying through your sprinkler if it's on a mist setting. They're out in a light rain, getting wet and bathing. So they keep those feathers waterproof and in good condition with daily baths. And preening, of course. So here's Sibley preening. You'll notice that he can turn his head all the way 180 degrees. And he keeps repeatedly, preening at the base of his tail, where there is an oil gland, a preen gland. So he'll rub some of that preen oil on the tip of his bill, and then he can rub that oil through his feathers to help, keep them shiny and waterproof and in good condition. You can see again in the video some of those little spiky pin feathers where he was growing, new feathers around his face. So as summer comes to an end, the days get shorter, usually by mid to late August, and then heavily through September and into early October, birds are migrating. So they will, really start feeding heavily, focusing more on nectaring so they can get that sugar to fatten up. Here again is their range map. So they're going to start channeling down to their winter range. A bird that's breeding up here in central Canada, southern central Canada, is just going to take, the most direct route straight down, through the States into the tropics. Oops, they're going to fatten up like a butterball turkey. But a lot of the birds that are breeding over here in New England, along the eastern seaboard, they're not going to fly way out of their way west and down. They're going to take the shortest route, which is actually across the Gulf of Mexico. So a lot of these birds will stage along the Gulf Coast, where they really fatten up like a butterball turkey, double their weight, and then when they wait for the winds and weather to be right, and they launch in sort of a leap of faith, if you will, into the winds in a nonstop flight across the ocean. It's more than 500 miles of flying, no place to rest, no place to refuel. So it's pretty remarkable when you consider that a bird that only weighs as much as a penny, a little more, I guess, when they're taken off for migration, is going to make that flight across the ocean and not refuel along the way. They have to leave, of course, because this is a picture of my neighborhood in winter. We don't get a ton of snow here in Georgia, but we don't have a lot of flying insects or nectar, blossoming flowers either. When they get on their wintering grounds, they hope to find the natural landscape, which is rainforest, cloud forest, lots of plant diversity. So there's lots of insects, lots of place to find shelter and shade, plenty of flowers for nectaring. Often what they find is agriculture. It's necessary for human survival. But when we can strike a balance, for example, growing coffee in the shade, we can sort of protect the habitat that the birds that we love that are breeding here with us in the summertime, but then leave in the winter. We can protect those habitats as well with some of our consumer choices. Some of the major threats to hummingbirds: habitat loss, of course, is number one, not only here, but again on their wintering range. So we need to worry about not just, conserving habitat where we are, but also at the other end of the bird's migration. Pesticides pose a huge risk to hummingbirds and other birds that are relying on insect food sources. Again, 99% of our terrestrial birds in the spring. And then also, in the case of hummingbirds, when you're spraying, you're also poisoning the nectar as well. Windows kill up to 2 billion birds every year in North America. Birds don't understand glass. You can see how it would be confusing when they see trees and sky reflected. Sadly, in our monitoring routes in Atlanta, hummingbirds are the #1 species that we find. We found over 100 different species of birds at some of the problem buildings, but hummingbirds suffer the most fatalities. Light pollution is a big problem for birds. So spring and fall, if we can darken our skies, that helps birds that are migrating. Again, sometimes not stopping to rest and refuel overnight. It helps them have safe passage over our cities. And then indoor cats kill, another up to 1 billion birds each year, free roaming cats. And I love cats. I've got 3 rescue cats. I let them come out and eat grass with me sometimes when I'm supervising them, but they don't roam where they can kill bird life and other wildlife. Ways you can help: so don't let your cat roam, treat your windows, turn off your lights, especially in spring and fall. put up feeders, drink straight grown coffee. But probably the best thing for the environment is to plant native plants. So especially the tubular shapes that the hummingbirds love. But your native plants are your plants that are not only going to provide places for shelter and food sources, they're also the the crux for insect breeding. So many insects are tied to specific plants. They can't lay their eggs anyplace else. And if we're not planting native plants, we're not supporting the insect populations that birds must have to survive and to raise their young. So if you love hummingbirds and you want to support hummingbirds, here's just a short, quick and dirty list of plants that you can choose. Well, honeysuckle, cardinal flower, bee balm. Red buckeye is actually a small tree, and I suspect you might find it in the Trees Atlanta plant sale that will be coming up later this summer. But whenever possible, you want to choose those native plants to support our birds and wildlife. For feeding hummingbirds, you just want to use white table sugar. I get this question a lot, and you don't want to, you might think, well, organic sugar, honey, those things are more natural, but they actually can contain traces of minerals that are harmful to the birds. They can harbor bacteria more readily than just our white table sugar. So don't substitute, just use white table sugar, 1 part to 4 parts water. If you heat it, it will kill germs and last longer. Don't fill your hummingbird full. They can't empty that in the time that it will spoil. So refrigerate the extra and refill your feeder often, just as much as the birds can drink in a day or two. In hot weather, you're going to want to change it every day, if not every other day. The rule of thumb for me is if I wouldn't drink it, I wouldn't want to offer it to a tiny little hummingbird. And never use red dyes. You don't have to take your feeder down in the winter though. We do occasionally have some species that miss the turn to the tropics and end up in Georgia. Sometimes they will actually come multiple years in a row. They'll be banded and reported for, so however their migration is off, it's consistently off each year and they return. So as long as you're keeping your nectar fresh, you can keep your feeders out in fall and winter. If you do get a wintering hummingbird, there's a study group that'll want to know about it. This penny down here just shows you the scale. There's a band. They put these tiny little bands on the birds so that they can mark them and study them, their return. If they're ever found deceased, they can find out where that bird has been. And that is all. I've got time for questions. And I am now going to turn on the camera for Star, who I know this is why most of you have probably tuned in, is to meet Sibley. So Sibley, I think I mentioned, was injured in a window collision. He was one of the lucky few that was rescued and brought to a wildlife rehabilitation center where they attempted to nurse him back to health, but the nature of the break on his wing was such that he cannot fly, will never be able to fly. But fortunately, because I volunteer doing wildlife rehabilitation and had experience working with hummingbirds, as well as have a job where I have the opportunity to educate people about birds and hummingbirds, I applied for the permits with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Georgia Department of Natural Resources so that Sibley could become an education bird. And he does Zoom programs, as you can see. We are returning to live in-person programs. So if you're interested in learning more or having a hummingbird program, meeting Sibley, You can find out more on our website. Sibley
All
has
right.
a companion. I'll show you where they stay. Oh, he's going to change perches here. Need some help, buddy? He doesn't fly, but he flutters and he hops. He manages to get around. When he's not on Zoom, he lives in this enclosure near this bright window. You can see my bird feeders. You can see his companion Polly in there, but she's not nearly as patient to just sit on a perch and pose for the camera. So she doesn't make many Zoom appearances.
All right, Melanie, I have got some questions. I think I'll start with the Q&A and then move on to the chat, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
All righty, so the first question that you got is, are hummingbirds monogamous?
They are not. The male will partner with any females he has the opportunity, to partner with. So no, they are generally pretty solitary and territorial. A male's definitely not going to tolerate any other males in his territory. That's why you don't see, if you've got one or two hummingbirds, it's during the summer, it's probably a breeding pair, but they don't tolerate others in their breeding territory. And once they've mated, they're done with each other.
All righty, the next one is, do hummingbirds see color?
Yes, in fact, hummingbirds and many birds see color much more richly than we do, because they can see color in the ultraviolet spectrum. So they see many, many more hues than we can detect with our eyes.
The next one, I know that you had a little bit about this in your slides, but it's just, what types of yard plants attract hummingbirds?
So there's actually a great resource that National Audubon has called Plants for Birds, where you can put in your zip code. I think you can even specify what species you're hoping to attract. But for hummingbirds, you want to be looking for plants that are native, again, because exotic plants that come from other places, other countries, didn't co-evolve with our insect life. So they're not supporting the insect life. So native plants are important for that reason. But hummingbirds particularly like those tube-shaped flowers like bee balm or cardinal flower or columbine. Jewelweed is another great one.
All righty. The next one asks, what has been the largest / heaviest hummingbird on record, and where was it located?
So the biggest hummingbirds, and of course I'm blanking on their name right now, live in South America, high elevations, I believe, but they're almost as big as a small songbird, so like a small sparrow, 4 inches or so. But in North America, most of our hummingbirds are going to be about the same size, give a gram or two to the ruby throat, which weighs, about as much as a penny and is about 1.5 inches long.
The next one asks, when they migrate, do they flock together at all? You'd think, being so small, they'd be so vulnerable.
They do not flock. They remain solitary pretty much, year round. There might be an evening when lots of hummingbirds are up in the air together, just based on, weather conditions and winds, especially as birds are launching on that, overseas flight. They're going to wait for absolutely the right conditions. So a lot of them may be taking off around the same time, but they're not intentionally flocking together.
The next one asks, do hummingbirds return to the same location to feed every year?
Yes, so if they're successful breeders, they do absolutely return to the same breeding range. Excuse me. Young will disperse. They don't want to return right to where they hatched it, and encounter their mother. So they'll disperse, 30 to 50 miles, but someplace nearby. So a hummingbird that hatched in Georgia is likely to return and breed in Georgia. But the adults who, successfully raise young will return to the very same garden, even year after year.
What is their natural lifespan?
So their average lifespan is 3 years. The oldest banded, recaptured ruby-throated hummingbird was 9, I believe. And I believe there are other species that have lived up to 12 years. But there's so much mortality in the first year. Predator, nest predators, anything that can get to a hummingbird nest would eat the eggs or young. All the threats from migration, the threats from pesticides, from habitat loss. So 3 is the average. Sibley is celebrating his 3rd birthday this summer, and we know that only because he was a juvenile and did not have his ruby throat when he was injured.
There is one person asking if you can put back the slide with the plants that attract hummingbirds. If you want to do that, I can take Sibley from the spotlight and you can share your screen again.
Sure, let me see if it will let me share the screen.
Alrighty.
Yes. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint, and if you want to take a picture of this slide, feel free, get ready to do so. It's nice. Is it showing again, Izzy?
Yes.
Oh, there we go. So a lot of these are, perennials that will come back year after year. Coral honeysuckle is a vine. And actually, unlike the invasive Japanese honeysuckle, which just takes over everything and doesn't support any insects, the coral is a bright red, gorgeous vine. So I love that one. I have that one growing along some steps that I have along at my porch. The red buckeye, as I mentioned, is a small tree. It blooms in March. So it's an essential, important food source for hummingbirds returning in early spring.
We've got another question that says, how far from the feeder hole can their beak reach? I want to be sure they can reach the nectar if I partially fill the feeder.
So Sibley's beak is about, an inch long, and their tongue is going to be at least, as long as that, double that, so 2 inches. So if you're feeding ports, if the nectar is, as long as it's within 2.5 inches, they should be able. My hummingbirds don't seem to have any problems, emptying it right down to the bottom. I have one of those saucer style feeders, which, let's see, I have it right here. Turn my camera back on here. I always like to let Sibley be the star, but if you can see me on my screen, my favorite style of feeder is the saucer style, because you don't have to fill it all the way to the top, and then the wasps and bees can't reach the nectar and they give up. So the birds don't have to compete with the buzzing insects. And then you can just, as I have said, just fill it a little bit and replace it regularly rather than leaving it there to spoil.
The next one is about Sibley. It wants to know if there is a prosthetic wing that could help him fly again.
I see a bright future for a young person that can develop such a thing, but no, unfortunately, there is not, the technology for a prosthetic wing. There isn't even, really in the United States, any technology to fix a broken wing. Birds' bones are hollow, and once they've set, short of re-breaking and setting, which there's no expertise in North America to do that I know of. If once a bird has a broken wing, a hummingbird, anyway, there's little chance to mend.
Yep, that would be great if that could be developed. The next one asks, do they have vocalizations beyond babies crying to be fed?
As I mentioned, just sort of little chirps and twitters. There's a great app. It's free. It's called Merlin. It will show you lots of photos of all North American species. It will play the sounds that they make, show you their range maps. So you can also, allaboutbirds.org online will play the sounds for you too. Unfortunately, Sibley does not chatter on demand, but if he's off his perch or needs help, I hear him. If, you know, Holly seems to chirp a lot more. She's a little more restless.
The next one wants to know, how can I protect hummingbirds from flying into the windows?
So there are some really great, maybe I can walk over here quickly and show you. If you see the window treatment that I just have, you know, basically for show, there's some polka dot, you can make those out, or stripes, you can buy decals, but it, you know, then it really doesn't impede your view through the window at all. But you can still, you know, the birds, it breaks up the reflection for the birds so that they understand the glass is there.
Alrighty. How are their numbers in the wild? Are there any endangered or threatened hummingbirds in North America or otherwise?
So hummingbirds in general as a family in North America are actually doing okay. All of our landscaped yards with our, you know, nectar sources have been helpful to hummingbirds. Habitat loss on the other end is a concern and a problem. There definitely are some declines in some hummingbird species, but some birds, because of our feeders and our gardens that we keep, you know, something blooming year long, have actually expanded their range along the West Coast. So they do need our help, but hummingbirds as a family, not as critically as some other species in other biomes.
I think the last two in the Q&A are both about Sibley. One wants to know, why does he rub his beak on his perch?
So that's a natural behavior in wild hummingbirds. You'll notice that he does it almost every time after he's taken a sip of his nectar. So he's just wiping off any sticky residues. But all birds will do a lot of shaping and sort of grooming of their beak to keep it the, you know, the right size, the right shape. So they'll rub it on a perch, you know, to keep it clean off food. Raptors, especially, think they're, you know, face into these, you know, bloody prey items. They're going to often be scraping their bill against what they're perched on to clean it and shape it. Beaks are made of the same material as our fingernails, keratin. So they continue to grow. So they do need that sort of, like a cat with its nails, they need to kind of keep it in shape and wear it down by that rubbing.
There's also a question about if Sibley will ever mate with his girlfriend.
You know, as I mentioned, they're generally pretty solitary birds, and that's been my experience having the two in care for education. They tolerate each other, but they're generally not too interested in each other. I think sometimes maybe in the spring, Holly seems a little more interested, a little cozier, getting closer to him in their enclosure. But for the most part, no, they don't pay much attention to each other.
I've gotten a few comments in the chat, as well as I just got one in the Q&A that mentions a lot of people haven't been able to see hummingbirds this year or haven't reported any sightings. Do you have any idea why that would be?
So they, you know, they kind of came through in larger numbers in March and April, but now the ones that are here are just the breeders, and they're keeping a very low profile. Moms are feeding babies. They don't want you to know where those babies are, where their nests are. You know, the males are probably still out there perching, looking for their next date, but you know, they're sort of settled on their breeding grounds and keeping a low profile. Come, you know, even as early as late July, but through August and September, we're going to have all the adults. You saw that map, all the adults from all the way up through Canada trickling back down on migration, plus all their offspring. So you can start to see a lot more in your feeders come, a lot more at your feeders come August.
The next question is, how and how much do hummingbirds sleep?
they go to the bed with the sun, and wake up with the sun.
All righty, let's see. I'm going to move on to the chat now.
So while you're checking the chat, I'll just mention quickly that you might notice that Sibley's nectar is not clear, like the nectar you would feed your birds at your feeders. He doesn't get protein regularly in his diet because he's not out flying around catching insects. So I have a special powder that's formulated for rehabbers and zoos, wildlife centers, that has the protein and vitamins that Sibley needs to keep him healthy. You'll also notice that I've got different textures and a variety of perches. He's on his feet a lot. He doesn't get that break flying around. So by having different shapes and widths and textures for his feet, I can make sure that his legs and feet stay healthy.
All righty. Why don't they breed when they reach their southern destination, or do they breed twice?
So a bird that breeds in Georgia may breed twice, especially if an early clutch is lost. She would try again. Those birds that take that extra time to get all the way up to Vermont or upstate New York or Canada, probably by the time they get there in May, and gets cold again there by the end of August. So it's 9 weeks of care from egg laying to saying bye bye baby. So they, if you're in a more northern latitude, they really only have one shot.
All righty. Do the little ones travel south with their mother, or are they on their own by then?
They're on their own. The order kind of reverses in the fall. In spring, we see the males first, but they're the first to leave because they've got no responsibilities at home. So as soon as the days shorten, they get those cues, the flowers aren't as plentiful, they leave. Females will hang around and make sure their babies are raised and ready to take care of themselves, and then they leave. And the babies probably still aren't quite ready, big enough, fat enough, efficient enough at finding their own food to migrate yet. So they leave the latest.
All righty. The next one is, how old are hummingbirds when they first start breeding, and how long do they live? I think you already answered the lifespan question.
So yeah, the average lifespan is 3. They would start breeding they hatch 1 year. But a bird that hatches in 2021 is going to hopefully come back and breed in 2022. But I will mention that, of all the birds that hatch, that breed here and hatch and leave this September, so we'll pick a nice round, simple, low number, 100 birds. Of 100 birds that leave, 75 are going to make it there. Only 50 are going to make it back to breed. So, they're really only replacing themselves from year to year. If they do better than that, that's great. But it's a hard life. There are a lot of hazards. So yeah, average life is 3, and they will start breeding as soon as possible.
There's another one that says, did you say the males come in first to pick the feeders? I was told they only allow certain females to feed on the feeders he picks.
So yeah, the males are the most territorial. They're going to definitely drive off other males. They typically will tolerate a female, especially a female that's going to raise his young. He might tolerate her, but I've never seen, more than a male and female at a feeder during the summer. Females are territorial too. They might not take on a male at the feeder, but they're not going to let wandering juveniles or other females come in their territory.
Are there bee hummers in Georgia?
Bee hummers, I believe that exist only in Cuba or Puerto Rico. I need to brush up on there's over 300 species of hummingbirds. So I'm sorry, I don't know. I can always keep them straight. But bee hummingbirds, their range is exclusively in the Caribbean.
Alrighty. I've just got a few more, if that's all right with you. I know we're coming to the end of our hour.
Sure, no worries.
The next one asks, what about snapdragons?
Snapdragons would have nectar. I don't think they're native though. So no little moths or butterflies will come and lay their eggs on your snapdragons, which means there's no, again, insect life, no little hatching moths for the hummingbirds or the caterpillars for other songbirds to eat.
Alrighty.
I would also just advise against making sure you're buying, especially if you're buying from big box stores, you want to buy plants that haven't been treated with neonicotinoids, pre-treated with pesticides, because again, that's just poison for your birds.
There's a few more. Do hummingbirds go into torpor every night for the full length of the night, or do they wake and sleep on and off constantly?
They don't go into torpor unless they need to. So unless they've gotten, they haven't migrated, they've stuck around too long and they're getting some really cold nights, or maybe they, or got chased away from a feeder and they really didn't get to feed toward the end of the day. They really only kind of slow their heart rate and breathing and go into torpor if they need to. Otherwise, it's very energy expensive to get themselves going again in the morning out of torpor. Okay,
and then there is one more. It says, what is the lifetime of a hummer? I assume that it would be similar to the lifespan of like what you mentioned earlier, or is it different?
A hummingbird in captivity, or
Yes.
Average lifespan for most hummers would be 3. They can live up to 10, give or take a year. In captivity, we don't know how long they can live because, to our knowledge, Sibley and his companion Polly, short for pollinator, are the only education hummingbirds in the world. We don't know of any others.
That is so special. I'm so glad that we got to see him today. Alrighty. So I want to thank you guys again. Thank you, Melanie, for being here with us today. There will be a recording of this webinar sent out via email afterwards. So you guys will have access to the recording in case you want to go over the rest, any of this great information that Melanie gave us today. And then we'll also upload this to our YouTube channel so you can see it there. Like I said, thank you all for being here once again. It was great. We got some great information, and I know we all love to meet Sibley today. So thank you so much, Melanie, for sharing him with us and being here with us today.
My pleasure, and I'm sorry about the technical difficulties.
Nope, that is totally fine. I think we're all used to it at this point in our lives. So yep, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.